Eleanor Ainsworth took a deep breath as the morning sunlight streamed through her window. Oak Haven, the small town in Pennsylvania where she lived, was filled with people who valued tradition and appearances. Having grown up in such a town, she had always lived her life mindful of others' opinions. "Eleanor, you're going to be late for the church meeting today." Her mother, Beatrice's voice echoed from downstairs. As the president of St. Peter's Church Women's Guild, Beatrice was a respected figure in the community. Her perfectly styled auburn hair and impeccable clothing reflected her way of life. "I'm getting dressed now," Eleanor replied as she fixed her hair in front of the mirror. When she went downstairs, her father, Richard, was sipping coffee while reading the newspaper. "Good morning, Papa." Richard was a man who had worked at the local bank for 40 years, rising to branch manager before retiring last year. His graying hair and the sharp eyes behind his glasses spoke of his exacting nature. "Good morning," he replied briefly, returning to his newspaper. "Clara called," her mother said. "Samuel was promoted to partner yesterday. Isn't that wonderful news?" Eleanor's sister Clara was her parents' pride and joy. She had married a successful lawyer, lived in a nice suburban home, and was celebrated as a model for young couples at church. "Yes, that's great," Eleanor smiled, but behind that smile swirled complicated emotions. "You need to find someone nice soon," her mother said. "Patricia's daughter is already pregnant with her second child, you know." Eleanor nodded silently. These conversations were a regular occurrence. On Monday, Eleanor returned to her usual work at the Oak Haven Art Museum. As an art restoration specialist, she worked to bring old paintings and crafts back to life. She truly loved this job that breathed new life into aged artworks that most people would overlook. "Eleanor, how are the preparations for the new exhibition coming along?" Director Susan popped into her workspace. "I'll be done with 2 more pieces. The 18th century miniature portrait is giving me a bit of trouble." "I'm counting on you. Next week's Art of a Lost Era exhibition is an important event." Eleanor nodded and picked up her delicate brush again. As she continued working with concentration, she sensed someone entering the room. "Excuse me, is this the art restoration room?" Eleanor turned toward the deep, calm male voice and saw a man standing there in modest jeans and a navy sweater. His brown hair was slightly long, and he wore intellectual-looking glasses. "Yes, it is," Eleanor answered, "but tours are only on public days." I'm sorry. I actually got special permission." The man smiled. "My name is Ethan Bell. I'm interested in antique art, and asked Susan if I could observe the restoration process." Eleanor was a bit perplexed, but nodded when she saw the sincerity in his eyes. "All right. I'm currently restoring an 18th century miniature portrait. Rococo style, isn't it?" Ethan approached her workbench and quietly remarked, "Known for its delicate brushwork." Eleanor was surprised. "You know art history?" "Just as a hobby," he smiled modestly. "I'm particularly interested in portraits from the 17th to 19th centuries." The two then talked extensively about art history and restoration techniques. As she showed him her work, Ethan's clothes were modest, but his words revealed deep cultural knowledge. "Would you like to come to the exhibition opening?" Eleanor asked boldly as they were parting. "I'd love to hear your professional opinion." Ethan smiled gently. "I'd be delighted." On the night of the exhibition opening, Ethan appeared as promised. He enthusiastically praised Eleanor's work, and after leaving the museum, they continued talking at a nearby cafe. Ethan said he was from Pittsburgh and currently worked in historical research. Eleanor gradually found herself drawn to his sincerity and kindness. Over the next few weeks, they began to see each other frequently. Time with Ethan helped Eleanor forget the pressure from her family. He always listened to her earnestly and never judged her. "Your work is wonderful, Eleanor," he said one evening, breathing new life into lost things. "It's like magic." She smiled. "You really listen to me." "My family," she trailed off. "What about your family?" Ethan gently asked. "My family doesn't understand my work, especially my mother, who only thinks it's time for me to get married and have a family." Ethan took her hand. "You have a remarkable talent. You should cherish it." However, as their relationship was deepening, Eleanor received a sudden call from Ethan. "Eleanor, I have to leave town for a while." His voice was heavy. "Family matters. I'm sorry it's so sudden." "For how long?" Eleanor felt anxious. "I don't know. I'll come back as soon as I can. I promise." After that, contact with Ethan ceased. His cell phone was no longer in use, and when she visited the address he had given her, someone else was living there. Eleanor was confused and hurt. The man she had believed in had vanished like an illusion. A few weeks later, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. Looking at the trembling pregnancy test in her palm, she cried. Despite searching for Ethan repeatedly, she couldn't find any trace of him. After much anguish, Eleanor made a decision. She would have and raise the child on her own. With this resolve in her heart, she headed to her parents' home to tell them the truth. Pregnant? The color drained from her mother, Beatrice's face. "Richard, did you hear what your daughter just said?" Her father, Richard's, face reddened with anger. "Who is the father?" "A man named Ethan," Eleanor answered with a trembling voice. "But I've lost contact with him." "I can't believe it," her mother gasped. "You've been abandoned." "No," Eleanor desperately denied. "He was a sincere person. I think something happened to him." "Something happened?" Her father laughed through his nose. "I've heard enough excuses from men." That night's family meeting was a nightmare for Eleanor. "You can't raise a child alone," her mother said coldly. "Either abort it or give it up for adoption." Her father declared, "Either abort it or give it up for adoption." Eleanor answered with a trembling voice, "I'm going to have this baby. I'll raise it even if I'm alone." Her father's eyes burned with anger. "Then go your own way, but be prepared to become the family's disgrace." Thus, Eleanor's battle began. On a Sunday afternoon, with winter sunshine streaming through the window, Eleanor sat on the sofa in her parents' living room, holding her 2-week-old son, Oliver, in her arms. A cold atmosphere pervaded the room, and it wasn't because the fireplace wasn't burning properly. "I thought you would reconsider," Beatrice said, straightening her back and crossing her thin arms in front of her chest. Her eyes were looking out the window, not at the tiny baby sleeping in Eleanor's arms, as if refusing to even acknowledge her first grandchild. "Reconsider what?" Eleanor answered quietly but firmly. "Oliver is my child. I don't regret my choice to have him." "A child without marriage?" Beatrice swallowed her words and shook her head. "What am I supposed to tell everyone at church? What about our family's reputation?" From the corner of the living room, Richard sighed. He pretended to read the newspaper, but his rigid expression betrayed his anger. "Isn't there something more important than reputation?" Eleanor said. The baby moved slightly, and she gently stroked his tiny head. "Oliver is innocent. He's done nothing wrong." "Look at your sister!" Beatrice's words cut sharply into Eleanor's heart. "Clara has a wonderful husband and a perfect home. She's living the life we expected. Why did you have to have a child without marriage? You've disgraced our family." Richard suddenly put aside his newspaper and declared. His voice was low and heavy, but it seemed to echo throughout the room. "We've lived as a respected family in this town for decades. The Ainsworth name has been a symbol of trust and dignity. And now, because of you." The front door opened, and someone came in with a cold breeze. It was Clara. Her perfectly styled blonde hair, elegant coat, and the way she held her husband, Samuel's arm made her look like she had stepped out of a magazine cover. "Sorry I'm late," Clara said with a smile, but that smile vanished when it turned to Eleanor. "Oh, you brought the baby." Samuel sat on the sofa somewhat uncomfortably and spoke little. He seemed to be trying not to get involved in this family issue. "Yes, of course," Eleanor replied. "Oliver is still small, so I can't leave him." Clara laughed through her nose. "You couldn't get married, but you think you can raise a child?" Those words struck Eleanor's heart. Tears welled in her eyes at the merciless words from her once close sister. But Eleanor looked down, trying not to show her tears. "That's enough, Clara," Beatrice said, but it wasn't to protect her daughter. She just wanted to avoid the argument from escalating. "Why did you call me here?" Eleanor quietly asked. "Just to criticize me." Silence filled the room. Richard stood by the window staring at the scenery outside. Beatrice clutched her coffee cup, and Clara sat next to Samuel, elegantly crossing her legs. "We've made a decision," Richard finally said. "You have no place in this house. You brought this on yourself," Richard said without turning around. "There is no place for someone who has shamed the family." Eleanor looked at her mother for help, but Beatrice remained silent, merely following her husband's decision. "We want you to leave now," Richard continued. "Just take what you need." In Eleanor's arms, Oliver began to make small noises. She gently rocked her son with trembling hands and stood up, fighting back tears. She headed to her room on the second floor. 30 minutes later, Eleanor came down the stairs with a bag packed with minimal belongings and baby supplies. Oliver was held against her chest, moving his tiny hands. No one was in the living room. Everyone had avoided the scene of their farewell. As she put on her shoes at the entrance, she didn't look back. She pushed all 32 years of memories in this house deep into her heart and opened the door. It had begun to snow outside. The cold wind struck Eleanor's cheeks, but she tucked Oliver into her coat to protect him. "It's okay, Oliver," she whispered quietly. "We have our own path." She began walking on the snowy road. There was anxiety and fear, but also a strange sense of liberation. She held Oliver tightly. No one could separate them. "Everything I need is right here," Eleanor vowed as she gazed at her son's tiny face. "You and me, we're going to grow stronger together." The snow continued to fall silently, gradually erasing their footprints. 8 months later, Eleanor's life had completely changed. The wound of being disowned by her family was deep, but she was determined to be strong for her son. With the help of Susan, the museum director, she was able to continue her art restoration work from home. She had converted a corner of her small apartment's living room into a workspace and worked with concentration during Oliver's nap times. Upon arriving at the museum, the receptionist, Wendy, waved. "Susan's been looking for you. She has something important to discuss." "Thanks," Eleanor replied, while pushing the stroller. The museum staff always cheerfully greeted Oliver whenever they saw him. When she lost her family, the museum staff had become her new family. When she knocked on Susan's office door, she heard a "come in" from inside. "Ah, perfect timing." Susan stood up to greet her, with cute Oliver too. She gently stroked Oliver's cheek and motioned for Eleanor to sit down. "I have wonderful news," Susan said excitedly. "Bell International has requested a very important restoration." "Bell International?" Eleanor tilted her head. "The big corporation?" "Yes, they have a collection of 17th century Dutch paintings and want one of their masterpieces restored." Susan pulled out some documents. "The compensation is exceptional. I recommended you because I know you'll do an outstanding job." Eleanor gasped. "Really? You're trusting me with such a significant project?" "I have no reason to doubt your talent," Susan smiled. "And with this compensation, you could move to a larger apartment, couldn't you?" Eleanor felt her heart fill with gratitude. "Thank you, Susan. I'll do my very best." "Wonderful. Their representative will be here tomorrow for a meeting," Susan said. "Dress formally." That night, after putting Oliver to bed, Eleanor pulled out a dress from the back of her closet that she hadn't worn in a long time. It was one of the few good clothes she had brought when she left home. As she ironed it, she felt nervous, yet excited. The next day, Eleanor headed to the museum's conference room. Wendy, Susan's secretary, was taking care of Oliver. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. At the far side of the large table in the center of the room, a tall man was standing by the window. The light from the window obscured his face, but there was something familiar about his stance. When the man turned around, Eleanor felt as if her feet were nailed to the floor. "Ethan?" Her voice was barely a whisper. The man standing before her was indeed Ethan Bell. However, his appearance was completely different from his previous modest self. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit with a confident bearing, he seemed like a different person. "Eleanor." His voice was quiet but seemed to resonate throughout the room. "Mr. Bell, you already knew her?" Susan asked in surprise. Eleanor was confused. "Ah, I'm late with introductions," Susan said. "This is Mr. Ethan Bell, secretary to the CEO of Bell International." However, the way the staff treated Ethan didn't seem like they were addressing a mere secretary. They showed exceptional respect and listened carefully to his every word. Eleanor's head was spinning. Was the man standing before her the same person who had suddenly disappeared 8 months ago, and was he really just a secretary? The meeting proceeded formally, but Eleanor's mind was filled with questions for Ethan. She couldn't meet his eyes, and he too seemed to be avoiding direct eye contact with her. Now why don't you two work out the contract details? Susan said as she left the room with the other staff. A sudden silence enveloped them. Eleanor, please let me explain, Ethan said quietly. 8 months. Eleanor's voice trembled. 8 months ago, you disappeared without any contact. I tried to find you. Ethan took a step closer. I lost your contact information. I've been right here. Eleanor said, Where were you, and what is all this? She pointed at his expensive suit. Who are you, really? Ethan took a deep breath and motioned for Eleanor to sit down. It's time for the truth, he said. I am indeed Ethan Bell, but I'm not a secretary, as Susan said. I am Bell International's heir. He stated definitively, born to succeed my father's company. Eleanor was too shocked to speak. Bell International was a global company with assets said to be in the billions. I was looking for someone who would see the real me, Ethan continued. Someone who would accept just Ethan, not my name, position, or wealth. That's why I was living with my identity concealed, and then you met me. When I met you for the first time, I could forget who I was. His eyes were sincere, but my father suddenly fell ill, and I had to return home urgently. After that, I was traveling around the world dealing with a company crisis. Why didn't you contact me? Tears fell from Eleanor's eyes. I lost your contact information. I had to change my cell phone. When I returned to Oak Haven, I was told you had left the museum. As their conversation continued, suddenly the sound of a baby crying came from the hallway. I'm sorry. Wendy hastily opened the door. Oliver's been looking for his mama. In her arms, Oliver was reaching out his tiny hands, seeking Eleanor. Ethan stood frozen. His eyes moved from Eleanor to the baby and back to Eleanor again. A child? His voice trembled. Eleanor took Oliver from Wendy and held him to her chest. My son. Oliver. The color drained from Ethan's face. When after you left, I found out I was pregnant, Eleanor said quietly. Ethan took one step closer, then another. His eyes were fixed on Oliver's small face, recognizing his own features in it. My son? Eleanor nodded slightly. Yes, your son. Ethan touched Oliver's small cheek with a trembling hand. The baby was a bit startled by the touch of a stranger, but soon calmed down and stared back at Ethan with large eyes. The moment their eyes met, the atmosphere in the room changed. He is my child! Ethan's voice trembled with emotion. Yes, Eleanor answered quietly. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes. Why didn't you tell me? I tried to, Eleanor said sadly, but I couldn't find you. Ethan put his hand to his mouth and took a deep breath. Eleanor, I'm truly sorry. If I had known... Ethan, I don't blame you, Eleanor said while holding her son. You didn't know. But Ethan looked straight into her eyes. Now I know, and I want to take responsibility. At those words, Eleanor was hit with complex emotions. Could she trust Ethan? Would he disappear again? However, she felt the same sincerity in the eyes of the man standing before her as she had before. Oliver is very healthy, Eleanor said, as if changing the subject. The doctor is satisfied with his growth. I want to know everything about him, Ethan said earnestly. Everything from the day he was born until now. They moved to the museum's small cafe, and Eleanor told Ethan about Oliver's growth one by one, his first smile, his first rollover, and the babbling he had recently started. Ethan listened with a serious expression, not wanting to miss a single word. However, when the conversation turned to family matters, Eleanor was evasive. Did something happen? Ethan sensed this and asked. Eleanor took a deep breath and told him about the break with her family, how she had been thrown out of the house, and that she had cut off contact since then. Ethan's expression hardened. They did that to you? Eleanor was surprised by the anger in his voice. So, you've been alone? I'm not alone, Eleanor smiled. I have Oliver. Ethan took her hand. You're not alone anymore. I'm here. Over the next few weeks, Ethan gradually became part of Eleanor and Oliver's life. He visited them almost daily, sometimes cooking dinner and helping with Oliver's bath time. His work was busy, but he always made time to be with Oliver. He's becoming attached to you, Eleanor said one evening, watching Ethan soothe Oliver. He's a wonderful child, Ethan replied proudly, "Strong and curious, just like you." Eleanor smiled, but anxiety remained in her heart. What would become of their relationship? Ethan led a life traveling the world as a businessman. How would she and Oliver adapt to that life? One day, Ethan brought a small box to her apartment. "Eleanor, there's something I want to tell you." He sat on the sofa, looking nervous. "I don't think we can start over." Eleanor's heart sank. "Because there's no need to start over," Ethan continued. "My feelings haven't changed from the moment I met you. I've loved you." He opened the small box and took out a beautiful emerald ring. "I want you to be with me, to become a family with Oliver and me, Eleanor." Eleanor gasped. "Ethan, isn't this too fast? We still don't know each other." "I know," he said. "We can take our time. I just wanted to express my feelings." He placed the ring in her palm. "Please think about it." Eleanor was confused. She had deep feelings for Ethan as well, but everything seemed to be moving so quickly and she felt hesitant. However, as she experienced Ethan's sincerity and kindness every day, her heart gradually opened. He always kept his promises, and his love for Oliver only grew deeper. "Eleanor," Ethan said with a serious expression one day, "I've been thinking about your family." Eleanor's face clouded. "They're not my family anymore." "They're still your parents," Ethan said quietly, "and Oliver's grandparents." "They threw us out." Eleanor's voice was hard. "I know." Ethan took her hand. "That's why I think it's time to show them the truth." "What do you mean?" "Let's visit your family home on Thanksgiving," Ethan said. "The three of us." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "You're joking, right?" "I'm serious." Ethan's eyes were filled with determination. "I want to show them how strong you've become. What a wonderful mother you are." And he smiled slightly. How foolish their prejudice was. Eleanor was silent for a long time, but finally nodded slightly. "All right, but I'm scared." "It's going to be okay." Ethan embraced her. "This time, I won't leave you alone." On Thanksgiving Day, Eleanor adjusted her hair in front of the mirror several times. She was dressed formally for the first time in a long while, wearing a simple but elegant dress that Ethan had given her. Oliver was also dressed in a small suit, looking a bit unhappy about his first formal attire. "Ready?" Ethan opened the door. He was wearing a perfectly styled suit, radiating the dignity of a successful businessman. Eleanor took a deep breath. "I'm ready." The three of them got into Ethan's luxurious car and headed to the quiet residential area of Oakhaven, where Eleanor's family home was located. The scenery visible from the car window was familiar, yet evoked painful memories. "There," Eleanor said softly. Ethan parked the car in front of her family home. The house hadn't changed. The well-maintained garden, the polished doorknob, everything was as she remembered. "Let's go." Ethan held her hand. Eleanor held Oliver and slowly approached the entrance. Before she could ring the bell, the door opened. Her mother, Beatrice, was standing there. "Eleanor?" Beatrice's eyes widened in surprise, and she was speechless at the sight of her daughter and the man standing next to her. Furthermore, when she noticed the luxury of the car, her expression completely changed. "Hello, Mom," Eleanor said quietly. "May we come in?" Ethan asked politely. Beatrice hurriedly invited them in. In the living room sat her father, Richard, and sister Clara, who also looked surprised to see Eleanor and her companions. "Forgive my late introduction," Ethan said in a calm voice. "I'm Ethan Bell, CEO of Bell International." 1 year later, in winter, Eleanor stood in front of a large window where snow was falling quietly, gazing at the scenery outside. Snow had accumulated in the vast garden, which was decorated for Christmas. A little distance away, Oliver was making a snowman with Ethan. Oliver was now 1.5 years old. He could stand firmly and had recently begun to speak small words. "Mama!" Oliver waved at her. Ethan also looked up and smiled at her. Eleanor gently placed her hand on her stomach. She was carrying their second child. According to the doctor, it would likely be a girl. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan approached from behind and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "About this past year?" Eleanor took his hand. "Everything has changed so quickly." Ethan and Eleanor had married 6 months ago. It was a ceremony in a small church, but as the son of the Bell family was getting married, the local papers gave it substantial coverage. Despite Eleanor's resistance, her background as the daughter of a prominent family in Oakhaven also drew attention. Eleanor now had her own art restoration workshop. Though established with Ethan's support, she had achieved success through her own talent and effort. Her skills were highly regarded in the industry, and important works were continuously being delivered to her. "There's been another contact from your family," Ethan said quietly. Eleanor's expression clouded slightly. Her relationship with her family remained complicated. On that Thanksgiving Day, when her family learned Ethan's true identity, their attitude completely changed, especially her mother Beatrice, who suddenly began to show interest in Eleanor and the baby. Her father Richard also showed pride in the connection to the Bell family. That hurt her. What they wanted wasn't her, but the connection to Ethan. "They want to invite us to Christmas dinner," Ethan continued. Eleanor sighed softly. "Will Clara be there too?" Her relationship with her sister remained cold. Clara's perfect marriage was cracking. Rumors said she was now separated from her husband, Samuel, due to his infidelity. "She'll probably be there," Ethan said. "Alone." Eleanor thought as she gazed at the snowy landscape through the window. She didn't hate her family. She just couldn't forget how they had hurt her. But now she had a new family, Ethan and Oliver, and the baby who would soon be born. She had become stronger. "Let's invite them," Eleanor decided. "We'll have dinner here." Ethan looked at her with surprise. "Really?" "Yes," Eleanor smiled. "Oliver has the right to know his grandparents," and she paused briefly before continuing. "And maybe they deserve a chance to change." A few days later, on Christmas Eve, warm light illuminated Eleanor and Ethan's luxurious home. The doorbell rang, and Eleanor took a deep breath before opening the door. There stood her parents and sister. "Merry Christmas," she said quietly. When they sat down at the dinner table, Ethan stood up with a glass in hand. With everyone's eyes on him, he smiled at Eleanor. "Eleanor is the most wonderful woman I've ever met in my life," Ethan said with emotion in his voice. "Her value lies not in my wealth or status, but in her own strength and love. I cherish what you overlooked." The table fell silent. Tears welled in Judith's eyes, and Thomas lowered his gaze. Ashley maintained a rigid expression, fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. Eleanor regarded them with a peaceful heart. She was no longer hurt. She had a loving family and her own life. Most importantly, she knew her own strength.